Hey guys, Stefan here. So today's video is about Bitcoin and urgency. So I've noticed in my time in the Bitcoin world that you tend to see cycles. So you tend to see people who might have first heard about Bitcoin but then disregarded it. But then during a big news cycle or during a big price run up, that's when they start getting interested to buy Bitcoin. But if you know, even from your traditional investment principles, that it's often, as Warren Buffett says, that you should be fearful when other people are greedy and you should be greedy when other people are fearful. But the behavior that plays out in the short-term news cycle, and that what you see from your friends on social media, is that they're often doing the opposite, the precise opposite of that. And they're buying in at the time that everybody else is buying in, and they're creating these really exaggerated hype cycles, and then you're seeing a big crash. And then that is the process, or has been the process over the last few years, of more and more waves, and each wave being bigger than the prior wave. So it's just a funny thing that really people should be learning to kind of zoom out and look at it more from at a long-term view, and that they should be approaching it more like a professional rather than sort of being an amateur who's driven by their short-term emotions and seeing something on the news and so on. Let me just flick into screen share now, and I'll just show you an interesting tweet by this Bitcoin guy. So here he's talking about the NVT ratio, which is the market cap divided by the value sent on the network. So I think he's leveraging some of the work used by Willy Woo, and so he's got this chart which is actually quite interesting from a behavioral point of view. So if you've been following the Bitcoin world for some time, like I have, you'll start seeing these same trends happen. And so what you see is during these yellow highlight sections, there when we've had these big buying cycles and big media hype, and that's the time that a lot of people have been buying into Bitcoin because of that process I was mentioning before. And then at the end of that cycle, you start seeing various economic experts or someone coming out and saying, oh look, I told you so, it was a big bubble, now look, it's all over. But then if you just look at what happened over the long run, then Bitcoin has risen dramatically from what the price it was at the time those so-called experts made those predictions. And so you can see that playing out here in this chart, where there's various highlight sections where they're the times that people would have seen it on the news and would have bought. But then in those times that nobody cares about Bitcoin, they're often the best times to buy Bitcoin. So that's coming back to that concept of how it's almost like people have the wrong sense of urgency. They're urgent to buy it when everyone else is buying it, but they're not urgent to go and buy it when nobody wants it, when actually it would have been the better time to buy it. And as a contrast, you can see this article here where it's quite a recent article, and an anonymous trader has bought 400 million worth in Bitcoin. So, and you can see that this has happened just at the recent crash from 20,000. And at one point in this recent cycle, it went from 20 down to 6,000. And this buyer has purchased approximately 400 million worth, or about 96,000 Bitcoins. Now, it remains to be seen whether this is a billionaire buying up their share of Bitcoin because, it's for their survival. They want to hold some Bitcoin in the long run, or this is maybe a hedge fund or an investment fund or a pension fund just buying up an allocation on behalf of maybe thousands of people. But it's an interesting contrast there, because whoever would be kind of gutsy enough to buy 96,000 Bitcoin at the time when it's crashing from 20 to 6,000 is obviously the person who's taking a much more long run view of this rather than being caught up in the short term news cycle. And so that brings me to the next point, which is really around how this article here is talking about the S-curve and the speculative Bitcoin adoption theory. And essentially it's looking at it like Bitcoin is a new technology and it's going to follow this curve in terms of adoption. And what you'll see is if you plot that out in terms of 0 to 100, then it looks like this S. And so you can see from prior history, this example here, where it shows various other technologies in the last 100 years or so, and you can see that it's not that these were just a bubble that went to 100 and then crashed. It's just that they were a new technology. So in the same way, nobody would say now, this internet thing, it's a fad. Nobody's going to use that in 10 years' time. Well, no, the internet is an integral and crucial part of how we live and how we work and all these things. So it's not that people are just going to drop internet use straight away. So that's the way I think you should be thinking about this. And another tweet storm that I thought was a good one by Neil Woodfine. And so this tweet is basically talking about utility tokens. And it's talking about how some services have come out saying, okay, look, in order to use our service, you've got to use our coin. An example of that would be Ripple with the XRP token, and they're hoping that enough people will buy the XRP token to use as part of their foreign currency service, which I believe is called XCurrent. However, this is really like a futile exercise in trying to create, a need to use a certain token, but it's just inserting an unnecessary middleman, because now people would have to hold their value in whatever they're storing their value in first, like their primary value, and then just buy some of this token and then use it, when it probably would just make more sense to just use Bitcoin natively inside the app, because then you would just have one money. It's, we're not going to be moving into a world where people have a certain kind of coin that they use to buy bread and another coin that they use to buy water and another coin to pay their rent. It just doesn't work that way. People would store their value in a few different things. Maybe they would keep some of it in property, some in shares, some in bonds, whatever. But in terms of cash and the cash equivalent or gold, people will want to store it mostly into one main asset rather than having like a little bit of each little one. So I just thought that was a really good tweet storm, which shows quite a good insight there by Neil. So I'll post that in the description as well. So the next thing I wanted to sort of talk through is that this is a process. We're going to move through a process first of a slow bleed, then we're going to start seeing more speculative attacks and people being more urgent and having more of a frenzy about trying to buy Bitcoin, and they might be going into debt to do that. Not that I recommend it. It's more just like a prediction rather than a prescription. But as that process plays out, we're going to start seeing people wanting to run to the best form of money. And so this chart by Trace Mayer is from his book, The Great Credit Contraction. And so this book is about 9 or 10 years old now. And one of the points I've seen him make, which I agree, is that we're in this stage now where the world is deciding which one is going to be the new money. Is it going to be Bitcoin? Which one is going to be the best safe haven value, more accurately? And so he's saying there's probably three possibilities. It's either US dollar, gold, or Bitcoin. And the Bitcoin maximalist argument here is that Bitcoin is going to be the best, is going to be the one that everyone runs to, because we're living in this world with all this credit, and as people start sort of appreciating the scarcity of Bitcoin, then people are going to start running to that, and it's going to become like a bit of a you're going to start seeing like that virtuous cycle, or that kind of self-fulfilling prophecy sort of play out. As more and more people start running to Bitcoin, what does that do to other currencies? Well, it pushes them down. And then as more and more people start seeing that, you're going to start seeing it spiral that way. And so I think we're already starting to see some level of this playing out, even with Zero Hedge's recent tweet. And this is from a JP Morgan report where they're saying Bitcoin's risk-adjusted returns have outperformed stocks and commodities. So how long is it going to be until more and more professional money managers and investors start pumping in a lot of their value into Bitcoin? Even if it starts as a small allocation, say 1 to 5% of their portfolio, what happens then? And so what I'm trying to draw out here is just to sort of compare and contrast the urgency with which people come to adopt Bitcoin. That's not necessarily in line with what the value or the investment potential of Bitcoin is. Because if you're able to really zoom out on that short-term cycle and think more on the long run, this is the sort of return you could have gotten. Over the last 5 years, if you bought, for every Bitcoin you bought, each one would be worth 10,600 more. And in a percentage terms, that's 40,000% return. So that's just some of the things that I think you have to think about when you're looking at, well, do I want to buy some of this or not? Now, the way I would think about this is you can either buy a fraction of Bitcoin now at $10,000 per coin, or it might go to 100,000 and you can buy a smaller fraction of a Bitcoin then. Or it might, and then you if you wait really, really long, well then you might only be buying an even smaller fraction of Bitcoin when it's 1 million or multiple millions per coin. So hopefully that's helped outline a little bit of my thoughts around Bitcoin and urgency. Thanks, guys.